When Damichael Cole talks about playmaking, making plays, you listen, or at least I listen. Joe Mullinax listens. And we are going to talk playmaking on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, arguably the most important piece of championship potential for Memphis. No, it's not a Finals Wednesday. This is our Thursday edition of the show, but we're going to continue our chat from yesterday and really focus in on growth and expansion of Memphis Grizzlies playmaking on this installment of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is a Thursday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, and we are so happy to have you with us wherever you are checking us out, however you take in your podcasts, whether it's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, literally anywhere. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, however it may work for you. Damichael Cole, the commercial appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, and I, Joe Mullinax of Bluff City Media and a contributor over at SB Nation, we welcome you to Locked On Grizzlies. We are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Again, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And special shout out to our everydayers. Damichael, I don't know if you saw this on YouTube. We're over 2,400 subscribers at this stage at Locked On Grizzlies. I'm not going to put pressure on our listeners and viewers, but Locked On Pelicans, similar market, right? New Orleans and Memphis, not that much bigger.
Give it to him, Joe. Give it to him. Give it to him.
About 7,500 subscribers. Now, Jake Madison, I believe, is the name of the host of Locked On Pelicans. He's phenomenal.
Really good.
Kudos
really
to him.
Good.
He deserves it. Much more success to Jake and Locked On Pelicans. But Damichael and I do a good job, so maybe a few more subscriptions, please. I'm the one begging, for the record. Damichael is not begging. I'm begging on behalf of myself and myself alone. But think about subscribing, rating, reviewing, commenting, liking, all those things. And at the very least, you check us out every day. Damichael and I are more than appreciative of that. Damichael, you made some really good points on our Wednesday NBA Finals edition of the show, talking about playmaking. So I thought that it made sense on today's episode to continue that conversation, let you kind of elaborate on your vision for Memphis playmaking. And then there's probably two guys in particular that jump out as the best examples of that heading in the next season.
Yeah, and we'll get into that for the most part. In terms of playmaking, right, where we started this conversation off, just to reflect some, if you haven't seen the episode on yesterday, the basis of this conversation started when we kind of went into the idea that in order to be a championship team, you're going to need multiple playmakers on the floor together who can kind of create off the dribble for themselves, for others. And this is something I saw Kevin Durant kind of touch on a little bit, but I looked into it, and it's like this is real, because if you look at a team like the Grizzlies, a lot of times teams are able to zero in the playoffs, at least, on Ja Morant, and Memphis isn't able to generate the same type of assist numbers and things like that. The offense just looks, to be frank, it just looks ugly, at times. It's not just Memphis. There are other teams, when I think of that, I think of the Minnesota Timberwolves. Right. That's another team, right? A bunch of talent, but playmaking just doesn't stand out as, they have 6 or 7 different guys or 3 or 4 different guys who can play make. And it's like, if Anthony Edwards is having a bad game, or D'Angelo Russell when he was there during the Grizzlies series, or whoever the case may be, Mike Conley, the playmaking isn't there. But that's what we want to focus on. Of course, now when we say playmaking, for the most part, we're talking about guys who can kind of get players involved from an offensive perspective with the passing, with their gravity, things like that. There are other avenues. For example, and we'll get to this more, Jaren Jackson Jr., I think, is a great defensive playmaker. Offensive playmaker, we probably talk about him a little bit later.
He's probably the worst one on the team, you could argue, in terms of offensive playmaking.
The worst one who gets a lot of playing time. I think the younger guys, and that's kind of what.
Sorry to interrupt you. For comparison's sake, we're using cleaning the glass for a lot of our stats on today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Jaren Jackson Jr. is in the 14th percentile among bigs in the National Basketball Association.
The entire league.
But he has the worst percentage among Grizzlies, to your point, that play a lot. Jaren played over 1,700 minutes in the regular season this past season, 4.8% assist percentage. So what assist percentage is what percentage of his teammates made shots did the player assist on? And again, thank you to Cleaning the Glass for that. 4.8%, that is a miserable number, Damichael.
Yeah, and it goes to our point, because this is, when you talk about the Grizzlies and playmakers, Jaren Jackson Jr., if he takes that leap, we're talking about a 60-win team potential.
Help.
We're talking about, you mentioned it yesterday, a 16-win team. That could be a 16-win team if you have him. I mean, when the Lakers went to double him, you saw it. There were troubles. And it's not even Jaren Jackson Jr., just him. I think we can have that same conversation eventually with Kenneth Lofton Jr. Because in Summer League, we saw it. He's going to be able to score in the low post in one-on-one situations a lot of times. Teams are going to draw doubles. I mean, we see there are certain matchups he'll have trouble with, but for the most part, he can get his own. But when I think it was the Cavs, when they threw those doubles at him, he had some trouble in some of those situations. But if you just look at him as a natural playmaker, I mean, he has the bounce pass, he can dribble, he can do those things. So the potential is there for him, just like Jaren Jackson Jr. He can dribble. We've seen him go between the legs, go off the dribble some, do all that stuff. The potential for these guys to be better playmakers is there. The Grizzlies need it to happen to take that next step.
The two best playmakers on the Memphis Grizzlies as we speak are Ja Morant and Desmond Bane. I don't think that'll necessarily surprise anybody, especially the Ja Morant part. And to Morant's credit, because on yesterday's episode, per usual, Damichael, I was given a hard time for my Desmond Bane.
Nothing new. Yeah.
16-game player take. Obviously, Ja is a better overall player, but definitions differ on that, and we can leave it at that. To Ja's credit, he is in the 96th percentile at 41.2% assist percentage. That is elite, and that is elite among point guards especially, which will be relevant when we talk about Marcus Smart later on in the show. Desmond Bane is in the 95th percentile, but Desmond Bane, according to Cleaning the Glass, is a wing. So Desmond Bane, a percentage much lower than Ja's at 20.2%. But again, he is not seen as a point guard according to our eyes and anybody that watches the Grizzlies play. He's not. He might be a backup point guard at times, but he is primarily a wing player. So between Bane on the wing and Morant at the point, you have two elite. If you're in the top 90th percentile and above of assist percentage, you are having a really, really, really strong season as a creator of a shot for others. Obviously, creating your own shot's important too. But especially for the Grizzlies, as they try to evolve their half-court offense, Damichael, they have to get other guys involved and find ways to do so, like you just talked about with Jaren. That burden has to be carried by Morant and Bane more so than Triple J.
Yeah, and as we get through this show, I think you mentioned Ja as the great example of the playmaker. We see Ja take leaps from year 1, 2, year 3 into year 4, and he's seen every coverage now. He's seen every coverage, and you see the way he attacks these coverages, whether he's being trapped, the doubles, the switches. Ja, for all the things that we talk about, he's good at. We talk about his IQ sometimes, but it's really up there. You've had guys like Draymond put him in the conversations with Chris Pauls of the world. Desmond Bane is the primary example we can use throughout this episode. If you want to see a guy who kind of went from a spot-up shooter with very little playmaking as a rookie to a guy who's developed into basically a secondary facilitator on this team. Dez is that guy, and not only just developed into that. You go back 2 seasons ago when the Grizzlies first started allowing him to play that secondary point guard role. His numbers were decent, but this year he took an efficiency jump. I think he averaged over 4.4 assists per game. And you just mentioned his numbers on Cleaning the Glass with his assist percentage among wings. Those two guys can carry the most of the burden, but pretty much every good team has 2 guys. You're probably going to need more.
Yeah, you're going to need more. And we'll talk about other guys that maybe are underappreciated, can maybe grow a little bit. I am going to mention one name that we may not be able to get to on the show. Somebody like Luke Kennard needs to get more opportunity. I know that I talked about it when the Grizzlies acquired Luke Kennard. What he did in Detroit was similar to what Desmond Bane has done in Memphis. And I know that Zach Kleiman, you've reported this to Michael and others, but Kleiman and Taylor Jenkins, the head coach of the Grizzlies, both have talked about using Kennard in that facilitating role not just as an elite three-point shooter. Don't get me wrong. I want him to shoot all the threes that he can. But for a team that is in search of that type of creator of offense, we have seen Luke Kennard do it before. It makes sense in Memphis to try to see if he still has that juice. And we'll talk more about that, of course, as the offseason grinds forth. But there's two newbies in Memphis who could potentially help with that playmaking process. We're going to talk about Marcus Smart, Derrick Rose, and whether or not they move the needle to help the Grizzlies get playmaking improvements next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's amazing. That's $200 that you can spend betting everything from money lines, over-unders, who you think is going to get the first home run. That's all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. We are talking Marcus Smart, Derrick Rose. Are they moving the needle toward championship playmaking relevancy for the Memphis Grizzlies? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, joined by my co-host, Damichael Cole, the commercial appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He's the Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. He also had the brilliant points yesterday in our Wednesday edition of the show, talking about playmaking. We decided it was a good thing to kind of elaborate on. Earlier in the show, we discussed Ja Morant, Desmond Bane. Those are the two guys that probably stand out in folks' minds the most in terms of being creators. Now let's talk about the two newbies, the two newest members of the Memphis Grizzlies free agency edition and trade, obviously, with Marcus Smart. That's Marcus Smart, Derrick Rose. I want to start with Smart, Damichael, because I think that Smart is the one, for a variety of reasons, that is going to be the most helpful of those two. I think most folks would agree with that statement. But I think that it depends on what lens you view him through. This past season, Marcus Smart had his best, and again, we're using Cleaning the Glass for our stats today, his best season in assist percentage, 25.6%. Okay, the previous season, he was at 24.4%. That was his second best season. So he's growing in this area. But this past season, Boston started Marcus Smart at the point guard position. He was viewed as a true point guard for the first time in his career, according to Cleaning the Glass, and that put him in the 37th percentile. Obviously, whether it's alongside Desmond Bane to start the season, Ja Morant eventually, Smart is not going to be the primary point guard for the Memphis Grizzlies. I anticipate this number being a career high. That's going to be one of my bold predictions when the season begins. I think he's going to be around 27% in assist percentage. Not because the Grizzlies are that much better than the Boston Celtics, but because he is going to be in a position where if it is a Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart starting perimeter group, that means he's the third creator. I don't know that Marcus Smart has ever been the third creator, even if you want to include Jason Tatum as someone who can get his own shot, which I think most logical basketball fans would say. Maybe he's always been secondary. This would make him a tertiary creator, and I think that's going to put him in a position to have a lot of success.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about it from the Boston perspective, because that team dynamic is just a little bit different in terms of most of the game you'll see him run the point guard, right? But when it's crunch time, it's not really running point guard as much. You know, it's Jason Tatum, it's Jaylen Brown, pick and roll, let them cook, and you go spot up somewhere. Now that is an advantage in a way where I think he can help the Grizzlies from that perspective of being a guy not just on the ball who can facilitate, but that secondary facilitating role. Again, something that Desmond Bane has done really good at, when he's getting attacking closeouts, driving kicks, things like that. The Grizzlies don't have a lot of guys who've shown at least a lot of efficiencies. I mean, can you just off the top of your head, Zaire Williams, John Conchar, David Roddy, thinking of those guys, running past 3-point line, doing kickouts to other players, nothing really comes to mind like that. Maybe a couple times.
And to your point, if we're going off of percentiles over on Cleaning the Glass,
Yeah.
I don't want to give the names yet because they might be in our underappreciated creators. I don't want to kill the lead. But you have John Morant, Desmond Bane, Tyus Jones, who's obviously no longer on the Grizzlies. The next wing on the list in terms of percentile is Dillon Brooks. And if you watch Dillon Brooks play Memphis Grizzlies basketball,
that tells you everything you need to know.
You know that was not a strength of Dillon Brooks' game, although he was in the 60th percentile this past season. So the Grizzlies, again, among returning perimeter players, and again, that drops a hint for what we'll finish the show with. Yeah. Among returning perimeter players, it's John Morant and Desmond Bane at 96th and 95th percentile for their position groups. And then it drops all the way down.
It's a cliff.
Santi Aldama as a big 7.6% assist percentage, 41st percentile. And again, and calling him a wing is being kind. It's probably LaRavia below him. That would be the next one on the list.
Yeah, and that's where we are. But I think, with Marcus Smart, he can give you that guy who can facilitate off the ball when think about it like this. When Dillon Brooks was being left open, because some teams, if we just got to be honest, some teams are going to try at least and see what happens. They're going to try to guard Marcus Smart the same way they guarded Dillon Brooks if he's on the floor with Ja and Dez in certain situations. They're going to try the same thing. But Marcus Smart, along with being able to knock down the open three-pointer, we'll see how that goes. But he has a different ability than Dillon Brooks to kind of attack and facilitate as the defense draws to him. So that's kind of where you talk about needle moving. That's kind of where he maybe moves the needle a little bit. Whereas the Lakers leave him open, he say, you know what, my three ball isn't falling today. He has more of an ability to attack. And then when, the defenders come at him, he can throw the lob to a Steven Adams or Jaren or kick it out to Dez or whatever the case may be. Now, as opposed to with Derrick Rose, I'm sure you're going to get to it more with him. But I've always thought of Derrick Rose more as a scoring point guard. He's kind of one of those, the new age point guards. After we saw the Darren Williams, you can put Darren Williams on the side with Derrick Rose, but the Steve Nash, the Chris Paul, the Rajon Rondo era guys, Derrick Rose was one of those guys that came right behind them. With Russell Westbrook, and basically pretty much every point guard you can think of today, Steph Curry, Damian Lillard, the list goes on. They're this new breed of scoring point guards where they score and then they'll get you involved when you're open. But at the end of the day, I think Derrick Rose can help from this perspective. He is a guy who can go get his own shot, and that's how I view a lot of the playmaking things. Because if you can go get your own shot, defenses will naturally draw to you, because if you can get your own shot, you can create advantages. If you can create an advantage, you can create a disadvantage against the defense, which will allow him to drive and kick or see things ahead and get other players on the team easier opportunities.
And Derrick Rose, to your point, and bringing back up Luke Kennard, when Derrick Rose and Luke Kennard overlapped a little bit in Detroit, again, whatever the Pistons were doing, at least in terms of assist percentage, it was working, because Derrick Rose, you're right, he does traditionally have more of a scoring guard vibe to him, but in Detroit, he was 37.4% assist percentage in the 2019-2020 season, right there as COVID came along. So that was the best of his career to that point, except for the 2011-2012 season, one of his best seasons, of course, right there around MVP time. So I think that he has it in him. He hasn't had a chance to display it. Obviously, with the Knicks, it hasn't been as successful. He had a really poor year almost across the board with New York, and we've talked about that. I'm more excited about Marcus Smart than I am Derrick Rose, but that's kind of a universal thing. That's across the board with a variety of skill sets. When it comes to playmaking, believe it or not, I'm going to be the most optimistic when it comes to Derrick Rose, because I think the Grizzlies are going to use Rose differently than the Knicks did. I think they're going to use that Pistons model, because they've talked about it with Kennard, and try to give them opportunities in the pick and roll that are advantageous to making Derrick Rose the most effective, especially during that John Morant suspension coming up.
Yeah, and again, they needed this scoring. I feel like they need more of these scoring guards. This was
or at least the threat of it. At least you have to respect it.
Yeah, like at the trade deadline, just having those guys who can come off the bench and from the guard position score more than 10 points per game. Not like Luke Kennard scores them. At the end of the day, what Luke Kennard did in the regular season was nice and dandy. Trust me. But I always figure postseason comes, all those wide open 3-pointers where you can you can blow some breath into your hand and take a picture, take a selfie and all that. That's not going to happen in the playoffs.
Right.
So, and we saw teams, I mean, the Lakers, not teams, one team. The Lakers they guarded Luke Kennard with guys who, I mean, were on them like a jacket. And the advantage was when he was on the floor, the Grizzlies kind of were able to play 4-on-4 in a way because they weren't leaving him. But at the same time, he wasn't creating the same numbers. Whereas a guy like Derrick Rose is prime for a postseason. Marcus Smart, he can kind of his regular season value can translate to the postseason because there is more, playmaking naturally in both of their games.
I think that they both, to varying levels, could be helpers in this particular Memphis playmaking area. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're going to finish out our Thursday edition of the show talking about underappreciated creators of offense. I might have given away the couple of names that we're going to discuss. If you followed the Memphis Grizzlies the last couple of years, you probably know at least one of them. But at least for me, another one was mildly surprising. We'll talk about who those two guys are next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies on this Thursday edition of the podcast. I am Joe Mullinax, co-host of Locked On Grizzlies. I also am the Memphis Grizzlies columnist over at Bluff City Media. I also contribute over at SB Nation. I'm joined by the Commercial Appeals Memphis Grizzlies beat writer, Damichael Cole. Follow him on Twitter at Damichael C. Follow me on Twitter at Joe Mullinax if you do not already do so. Between the two of us, you have come to the right place for Memphis Grizzlies content, and we hope you'll continue to do so each and every day as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network. Damichael, we've talked about Ja Morant and Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart, Derrick Rose. These are all names that you expect to have some level of playmaking ability. Maybe not elite playmaking ability. Like it's fair to say Smart and Rose are not elite. I think Bane and Morant are at this stage, at least for their position groups. Here are a couple of names, and maybe one of them shouldn't have surprised me, and it didn't because I assumed he was one of them. The other one would be mildly surprising. So I mentioned earlier, and again, this is cleaningtheglass.com. Ja and Dez are, with a bullet, the top two returners in terms of assist percentage. Guess who third place is? Guess who third on the team is in terms of percentage, but percentile in particular?
Are you asking me to guess this?
Yes.
It's two guys that come to mind.
Okay.
And
they're both relatively close.
They're both relatively close. The guy I want to say is Steven Adams, but I'm going to say Xavier Tillman Sr.
You're correct. The correct answer is Xavier Tillman Sr. Tillman was in the 69th percentile among bigs.
Real good with the dribble handoff. Yeah.
And Steven Adams, 67th percentile at 10.8%. Adams was better the year before in terms of that connection with Desmond Bane that folks that follow the team remember pretty fondly. Those two had a real chemistry together on the floor. And Adams was excellent at finding, the Grizzlies love that elbow motion, right? Whether it's coming around a guy on the elbow and setting a screen, that handoff that you just dribbled handoff kind of play. And that explains why the next three, I'm not going to include Kenneth Lofton Jr. because he only played 113 minutes. Yeah. But the next three that are returning Grizzlies players, again, Morant and Bane are 1 and 2 in terms of percentile for their position group. Tillman is third. Adams is fourth. Brandon Clark is fifth.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when I talk about trying to be creative with the Grizzlies half-court offense, I talk about the money ball idea of replacing things in the aggregate, right? If you're not able to acquire a Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, can you get that same level of production from LaRavia, Roddy Williams, some combination of that? Here, it's a similar concept. If you don't have an elite creator of offense by themselves or for others, guard, which aside from Bane and Morant, they don't necessarily have. You need to replicate that in the aggregate. And I do think that, to Taylor Jenkins' credit, he gets a lot of hard times at times for his X's and O's and scheme. I think that the Grizzlies do really well at this. Maybe the Denver Nuggets are the only team that's really better at it, at getting their bigs involved in terms of creation for others. They find multiple ways to do it, and it shows in the numbers as well as when you watch the games.
Yeah. I'll play devil's advocate here because this is one of those things I think is cool for the regular season, but it's not probably going to translate as much for a postseason run, particularly with the Grizzlies. I mean, with the Nuggets, yes, it did. But here's the thing with those guys that we mentioned, Steven Adams, Xavier Tillman Sr., and even Brandon Clark to a certain degree.
To be fair, they are all considered above average in terms of creation for their position group.
Exactly. Oh, I am not disagreeing with that. I do think all of those guys, especially Xavier Tillman and Steven Adams, are pretty good creators. In fact, touch on Steven Adams before I get to the point that I was making. I remember having a long conversation with Steven Adams actually about the fact that you've what's up with this? All of a sudden in your career, you've become like this playmaker. And of course, anything about Steven Adams, he deflects all the credit for everything. His offensive rebounding numbers, he always blames it on the Grizzlies missing shots instead of saying, I'm just bigger and stronger than these guys. So, of course, when we talked about the assist number, he goes, oh, mate, it's just, the NBA is changing, which was a solid point to make. He basically said the NBA is changing to the point, you remember, this pick and roll era. There's all these different ways that teams have initiated offense over the course of the NBA. Now we're kind of moving into an era where the bigs, because now you're seeing more bigs come to the NBA that can dribble, that can shoot, that can pass. Now the dribble handoff and having these guys, do split actions and things like that, which are big handling the basketball, like Golden State, has done with Draymond Green, Andrew Bogut, and guys like that over the past 10 years or so. But here's the thing with the Grizzlies. What made the Nuggets so good in those situations is you really couldn't switch it against Jokic. And if you did, it was automatic 2-point scoring at the basket. In the playoffs, teams switch more because they're going to take you out of your offense. It's more about you got to score against me. That's why I emphasize the shot creating standpoint, because Steven Adams, why I can't make sense of it, because I think as strong as he is, there are so many times I feel like Steven Adams could just bully ball a guy and just lay it up over their head. But it doesn't happen a lot. I mean, go back to the Golden State series a couple years ago where Golden State was playing the small lineup. Yeah. And Steven Adams, granted, he came and made an effect on the boards. But I think I remember correctly, and it was like game 4, maybe game 5. He hit a couple easy baskets at the rim. And I was like, okay, yeah. Maybe it was game 6. When they lost. He had a couple easy baskets at the rim. I was like, okay, he can do this all game. But then it just didn't happen. And, he missed a couple and whatnot. But I feel like there's more there in terms of Steven Adams dominating these mismatches from a scoring standpoint. Rebounding, he's gonna play volleyball at the rim with those dudes. But from a scoring standpoint, same thing with Xavier Tillman Sr. There are instances you've seen, forwards, like big forwards, though, Kawhi Leonard's, LeBron James, those guys hold their own against Xavier Tillman Sr. and switches and things like that. And then you go down the list, Brandon Clark, great floater. He can get to it. He's probably the most proficient in those situations. But as opposed to in the regular season, I think it's great because you're going to force defenses to try to recover. And by the time they recover, you're making the pass and Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Dylan Brooks, whoever the case may be, those guys cutting to the rim, easy 2 points. Those guys are really good in those situations. But I want to see them more create for themselves to put defenses in tougher situations, not just for the regular season, but for the playoffs. Because quite frankly, teams shouldn't even be thinking about switching against Steven Adams.
That's true. He doesn't have that level of game that other bigs, obviously Nikola Jokic being the biggest example, but there's lots of NBA bigs that have a larger offensive bag of skills, at least ones that they're willing to display, than, Steven Adams. Domantas Sabonis comes to mind as a guy who's really good at similar things to Steven Adams, but he's also a really good scorer too. So I do agree that there's no substitute for perimeter scoring, but in the Grizzlies' current situation, they have to try to find it wherever they can. Thank you so much for listening, watching, however you're taking in Locked On Grizzlies. It is appreciated. Again, proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day, free and available wherever you get podcasts. You can also check us out on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, all those fun things. On our Friday edition of the show, Damichael, what were you thinking of discussing in terms of a general vibe? Because I'm going to be honest, I feel a cold coming on. I might not be able to join you on the Friday episode. I might need a day off. What are you thinking for a Friday show?
You heard it here first. Joe is load managing Locked On Grizzlies.
I need a load management day. I'm getting old, Damichael. I'm getting old.
He's pulling a Kawhi Leonard. He's getting throat tendonitis over here, and he's gonna. But we'll see. I've been keeping tabs on what's going on with the players currently on the team. Caught up with some former Grizzlies recently as well. Tony Allen, Kennedy Chandler. And maybe we'll deflect on some of those things, reflect on some of those things. Had a good conversation with Kenny Chandler about his run with the Grizzlies. We'll probably talk about some of that as well. But, I mean, there are so many ways we could talk about this again. We might even bring on someone. Might even have a special guest. So just stay tuned for that.
Ooh, interesting. So Damichael's going to keep it live and fun for you on the Friday edition of the show. Make sure you're checking it out. I'll be back on Monday. My day job's starting to pick up a little bit. That's the real reason why, football season's starting. And with football getting loaded, that means I need to get my life together in that space. But I'll be back on Monday. So will Damichael, and hopefully so will you. We're so excited to continue to grind forth as July closes out here on Locked On Grizzlies. Wherever you get your podcasts, we're free and available. Stick with us. For Damichael, I'm Joe. This is Locked On Grizzlies. Have a good one.